Meet Rick Goodman, an American scientist who moved to Singapore with his Taiwanese-American wife 13 years ago. Rick told me why they chose Singapore over Taiwan, what challenges foreigners face when their kids are in local schools, and why he would give up his American citizenship for Singaporean. And Max, your best YouTube friend, let's go.
My wife and I came here, it was just the two of us in 2011.
Yeah.
And then both of our kids were born here a few years later. We're not PRs at the moment, but we're seriously thinking about doing a change. Not so much, I think for us as Americans, there isn't necessarily a huge advantage to becoming a PR.
Yeah.
For us, our kids are already sort of in local school systems, so that was one of the big advantages normally PRship would offer. But honestly, just in terms of, maybe even possible path to citizenship, the U.S. is having some rough spots, let's just say, and we'll see how the next election goes. But as we think about where we want to, retire to, how do we want to spend the rest of our lives, and Singapore is a great place to be, but of course, if we're not working, we can't be here.
Yeah.
Even as a PR, you have a limited time frame. So there's a part of me that would think, if the government would offer me a passport, would I change my U.S. passport for the Singapore passport? Yeah, almost definitely. But obviously, it's a lengthy process, and we just haven't started that yet. But we might.
And let's say if you do that on emotional level, would be difficult for you.
Yeah, I think about it a lot, but it is hard at the emotional level to think about to give up that American passport. Oh, it would be great, never having to pay U.S. taxes ever again, and all the frustrations that come with that. But it is tough to think about no longer being an American, because you grew up knowing, seeing America is great, whether you still think it is or not. It's certainly fantastic in many ways, and there's things you can do there that you couldn't do elsewhere, including in Singapore. But raising a family, Singapore is such an easy choice as a better location. To retire, if you can afford it, or if you're a citizen and in that sense becomes more affordable, healthcare system is so great, it's clean, it's safe, all the usual things that, all your other interviewers, would espouse on is true. But it would be very, very tempting to change for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Our children are in local school, so that's given us a much greater exposure to what it's like growing up in Singapore than we would have been if we'd just come here and we didn't have kids, or if our kids were in international school.
Yeah.
Obviously, my wife and I didn't grow up through the Singapore school system, so we've had to learn what that's all about compared to the American school system. It's been interesting both from an academic sort of perspective, learning the topics, because their curriculum is so intense and so impressive.
So it's more intense than it would be in the U.S.
Absolutely. I mean, probably even at your top private schools in the U.S., it's hard to imagine the curriculum sort of matching what you get from the local school system here, at least from an academic perspective. And it's high pressure, but the topics are crazy. We really wanted to make sure that children are bilingual from an early age. So other than I did a little bit of extra Chinese tuition, we didn't want to do the whole tuition chasing game, which basically means my wife and I are our children's tutors. So I cover math and science as a scientist, and my wife does Chinese and most of the English. So we sort of split the English. The math curriculum, my daughter's P5, my son's P3. And at P5, she comes home with homework, and they get a lot of homework. Sometimes I look at the math question and I was like, okay, I have to think about this. I'm a PhD from Harvard in a hard science, and I have to sit there and look at what would be fourth grade, equivalent of fourth grade in the U.S. And sometimes it takes me a while to get the answers. She's preparing. She's taking math Olympiad and science Olympiad this year as well.
Yeah.
So I've been helping support her, tutor on that. And the math and the science questions are just such an advanced level compared to anything you would see in the U.S. for, until, I would say high school, in this case, some years ahead of that. But it comes with a lot of, pressure, a lot of homework, like I said. My kids are in a very, very local school. As foreigners, we didn't have any say in the balloting system for entry into P1 local school. We were fortunate, my daughter, the older one, got a spot in a local school, which made us very fortunate. There's obviously no choice where you go, so it's in a very local school in the Northwest. A school that many would say, from a Singaporean perspective, would be looked at as sort of very undesirable school. But it's been fantastic. And we were very lucky. My son, who's a P3 now, also got into the same school, which again at the time was seemingly almost unprecedented, or at least we didn't know anyone who had 2 children in the same local school. You know, the school is amazing. The teachers are just incredibly caring. The principal is extremely impressive, really on top of her game, really, you know, just the way the school supports the children, the way the school pushes and encourages the children, but without sort of dehumanizing it. You know, they treat each student as an individual, their strengths and their areas for development, and they focus on that. And I think the Singapore local school system, you know, is famous for really, it develops talent, right? It's very much a system for looking for key talent that they can foster through the Singapore education system, and then, you know, possibly into, you know, civil service for the government or in industry. And, you know, they look for early bloomers, and they push those early bloomers right from P1. I mean, it seems, from an American perspective, it seems kind of funny that, you know, they look at 7-year-olds and they say, okay, this person really has potential. But they do it, and we see that, and they push them. But they also try to bring, you know, the other, 80% of kids who are sort of more average or late bloomers or need more help. They do things to try to support them along the way, so that their education is also extremely impressive, but without necessarily constraining their early, you know, the ones who can be pushed to the great limits at the same time. So it's interesting how they manage to find that balance. And I think in the past, the Singapore school system would be looked at as sort of, well, it's very driven by rote memorization, you know, let's say in science or in English, or pushing things in a more sort of almost Chinese-centric kind of way. I don't mean Chinese language, but more like sort of Chinese education system. I think the beauty of Singapore, like with all of the things the government does here, is dynamic, right? They look out to the future. They see what is needed for this country to survive, not just survive, but thrive and excel going forward. And how do we plan to get there? And that starts with the education system and with the children. And how do we foster a curriculum that will serve to benefit them as individuals, but us as a country and as a nation and as a society. And they, you know, that curriculum evolves. And so we've seen that. So like, you know, I'll admit there are certain things you might get frustrated with. Like they take a science test and they may be marked off for, they use the word clear instead of transparent. You know, they're looking for certain words. But you also see, you know, in the news, well, that, you know, the education minister, the graders of the PSLE are looking for ways to not, you know, to move beyond that system. So if we can see that the students really understand the topics, don't just mark for are they using keywords or not, and evolving that system so that, you know, it ultimately gives what they're looking for, which is well-educated, well-meaning, well-capable citizens for this country. And you have to respect that. You have to respect that.
Fellow parents in Singapore, let me introduce a leading international school that might be a perfect choice for your child's future. Meet Stanford American International School. More than 3,000 students from over 79 nationalities already study there. And I, as a father of 2 daughters, really value schools that go beyond academics to help students develop their unique talents and potential. This approach prepares them for the real-world challenges of the future. The strong faculty of teachers from over 40 countries are committed to providing students a truly international education. But not only the level of education is high, the learning environment is also excellent. For young ones, there is a space with UV protected outdoor and sensory play areas. Older kids may enjoy modern facilities, including 500-seater theater, science labs, libraries, gyms, 3 swimming pools, innovation centers, a rock climbing wall. It's a pity I'm not a child anymore. Choosing the right school for your kids is a crucial decision. Therefore, I recommend contacting school professionals as soon as possible. You can schedule an on-site or virtual campus tour, book one-on-one consultation session, or ask any questions you have. Click the link below, leave your details, and the Stanford American School team will contact you soon. I wish your child all the best.
Was it difficult for you to find a good local school, not being a PR?
Yeah, so the way it works is we had no choice. We had no choice at all. So as you ballot, you know, as you try to get your child into P1, it's the balloting system. And of course, first sort of dibs go to citizens, and there's an order within citizenship as well. And then PRs are sort of after citizens, and then foreigners are sort of the last phase.
Exactly.
So at that point, I don't, you know, the numbers aren't really widely shared. I think it's usually conjectured about maybe 5% of foreigners get their child, let's say, into a local school. And you have no choice in the matter. It's a totally black box from a public eye perspective. You could be living in Jurong and your kid may get assigned to Tampines on the East Coast. In our case, it was the school that my child got was my first child got was relatively close, about 4 kilometers away from where we were living at that time. Probably helped that we were sort of off in the, not really Ulu area, but it was kind of sort of Bukit-Gombak, a little bit out of the way. So she was given a spot at a school, no choice in the matter. And then the other thing I think most people don't realize is that as a foreigner, if you have a sibling coming along, like a second child, like my son, 2 years later, there's no sibling preference, both in terms of do they get a spot in local school at all, let alone the school that your older child is in. So again, as a foreigner, you may have one child given a spot and your second may not, or they may both get a spot, but they may be in different schools, which may be challenging. Like I said, in our case, we were very pleasantly surprised and fortunate to get both our kids in the same school. Again, probably helped that it wasn't one of your more highly desirable schools, but we were very happy to have both of them go there, and it's just been a great experience for us and for them. But yeah, you have no real say in the matter, and you can't change also. So once you're there, if you move, you're not, only in extreme circumstances like where the child's safety is a concern or something like that, would they at least publicly entertain a change of school.
Yeah. What about sports? Like in the US, it's a huge focus on sport. Like it's a big part of the culture, basically.
Yeah.
In Singapore, it feels like it's not the case. Based on the school experience for kids, what do you think?
No, clearly, the system here clearly definitely emphasizes the academics over, let's say, sports. Of course, there are sports offered, especially popular things like badminton and basketball and things like this are pretty popular. But the ones that are built up to be like the students that get respected in many ways, even among their peers, are the ones who do best academically. You see that, which is very different from the U.S. And that's probably good for me and my family because we're a lot more academically focused than sort of athletically. But in that sense, it's very different than your average American education experience, definitely.
Speaking about the universities in Singapore, like, would you want your kids, let's say, go to one of the, like, NUS, let's say, or you would love them to see them in Harvard, like, as yourself?
I think ideally we are kind of keen to see our kids go to U.S. for university. I think, our current plan is still, local primary school, probably local secondary school, JC, go through that, that whole experience if we can. But for university, I really think, just like myself, like I went to high school in Southern Arizona and then moved to the Northeast to Boston, for university and then for graduate school. And, for me and my wife, we both agree, it's important the kids go somewhere away from their parents for university. I mean, that would be typical in the U.S. It's obviously different here in Singapore. But with that experience that we know, you get a very different experience. And I still think right now, the higher end U.S. universities are still the best ones in the world, in my view. And so if our children are fortunate enough to do well enough, continue to do well enough that they can go to, to a top U.S. university, it's still our ambition to do that, even if after university and before university, they're still here in Singapore, which is, again, a hard place to be from a living perspective.
In Singapore, it's a different story. It's very common to have like multi-generational family. It's like grandchildren, like their mom and dad, and then grandparents live in the same place. And then, let's say when the kids, they grow older, they get their HDB, and then they get married, they get their HDB, and then they move out like between 20 and 30 year old, sometimes even after 30.
Yeah. And of course, that's become more challenging, both with property being as expensive as it is, or an HDB availability. Obviously, pandemic skewed a lot of things. But then, the factors as well of Singapore is such there's a bubble. Obviously, Singapore is kind of a bubble in many ways, safety and cleanliness. A lot of Singaporean parents are understandably trepidatious about sending their children overseas for university or other experiences.
Yeah.
They fear crime, understandably, in certain areas. They fear just that independence, if releasing them for that. But I think you see it more and more. People going to Australia, US, UK for school, and whether they stay there for jobs after that, or they come back to Singapore, or if they have or depending on what they've done with NS service, if they're male, they can maybe get the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
I think Singapore is really good at not just identifying good talent, but then also, if they're going into government, giving them the right experiences, maybe overseas and coming back, getting that international perspective, bringing in not just foreigners into the local environment to help build the ecosystem, but also taking Singaporeans and try to put them into key positions outside and bringing them back to take those learnings. amalgamate the best of what they see overseas and make it work from a Singapore perspective. It's hard to think of another country that does a better job of that, frankly. But I think you need to spend some time overseas to get that experience because it is a big world out there and a lot of different things to see and do.
Yeah. US seems like one of the best places for scientists like in the world. How would you compare career as a scientist in Singapore versus the US? Well, the market is much, much bigger.
Broadly speaking, yeah. I mean, the US, as a scientist, your opportunities are going to be more diverse because there is every type of science and every type of industry is present in the US, obviously. So as long as you're willing to, you may have to move. California and Massachusetts are two very different places on opposite sides of the country.
Yeah.
So it's not like Singapore where you can get a new job and you just drive 10 minutes, 10 minutes in the other direction. You may have to do a more serious relocation in the U.S., but you have a probably broader array of the types of things you could do there than in Singapore. So I do think it is challenging for a scientist coming out of let's say at US or NTU. They got a number of very strong scientific academic programs here. You come out, you get your degree, maybe your PhD. You can join companies here, and there is an array of different ones you can join here, or you can join the government through something like the EDB, or you can join A-STAR, sort of a mix between government and academic and industry. You can develop there, but it is hard to replicate the breadth of the ecosystem in a place like the U.S. In that space. But there are many places that could mimic that. More and more, China is starting to become stronger in that area. I think there was a long period where China was, but I think they saw where it was belonging, and they did a great job of sending university and graduate and postdoc students to the U.S. to get very strong scientific educations, practical hands-on education in the U.S. And initially, many of those folks would stay in the U.S. because jobs were there and they found newfound freedoms being in the U.S., et cetera. But yeah, obviously, you can see over the last 5, 10 years, maybe even 15 years, more and more of them have gone back to China, been able to start businesses, been able to do really well, both from a financial and career perspective, and to build businesses in China. And I think the U.S. has lost something as a result of that. But obviously now, with China-U.S. geopolitical tensions, lots of things are much more complicated than before. Yeah. I think Singapore, still has that benefit of being able to actually learn from both China and the U.S., send students to either place. And I think as a scientist, there's a lot to be said too. If you don't go to university in one of those places, maybe take a job there for some period of time and eventually come back. You may want to raise a family in Singapore, understandably, but spending some time overseas in your early career, or for academic or for your diploma, there's a lot to be said for that. As good as the system is here, there's certain things you can't replicate here right now that you could get from overseas, at least for a period of a few years.
Your wife, she's a Chinese speaker.
Yeah, so she's Taiwanese-American.
She's Taiwanese-American.
Yeah, so she born and raised in the deep south in the U.S., but spent a lot of time growing up in Taiwan. Her family's from Taiwan and from China. Yeah. So a very fluent Chinese speaker. Which was an influence in our decision when we moved here in 2011. Yeah. And part of why it was important for us for our kids to be multilingual as well from the beginning. Yeah.
Would you consider going to Taiwan instead of Singapore?
Taiwan. Have you been to Taiwan?
Yes.
Yeah. Taiwan is a great place. We spend, outside of Singapore, it's the place we spend the most time. So we spend at least one of the long school holidays there each year. And we think about moving there as well. It's tough. I think there's two things. One, from my career perspective, it's a little tough because the job, economically, Taiwan's in a much different place than Singapore. Just in generally, the economy has been kind of stagnant for a long time. Wages are really low. Things like rents are really low, but that's probably because the wages have been low for quite a while. And from a pharmaceutical perspective or that sort of scientific environment, they excel in a couple of places, but it's difficult from a general perspective. So unless you have sort of like a global role, it would be hard to have a maybe good local role, especially if you don't speak Mandarin or Taiwanese. Yeah. So for me, that's a little bit difficult. But we love the environment. It's a great place. So similar to Singapore, a great place to raise kids. It's safe. The food is fantastic. So, again, similar to Singapore. It's got a bigger sort of nature environment ecosystem to play on. Singapore has a wonderful natural park system that we love. But Taiwan has a bit, obviously, geographically more diverse, a much bigger place. So there's a lot to be said for that as well. I think we think about retirement options there as well. I think the main concern right now, obviously, is the geopolitical environment. The concerns that
uncertain.
Is Taiwan going to be able to stay what it is now for how much longer or indefinitely? I think, if the day ever comes where that changes, it would be a big shame. And I'm not sure. It's a little bit scary to think about being an American in that living there during that situation.
Yeah.
So that holds us back a little bit.
You understand Chinese? You don't speak or speak?
I can understand a little bit from being around my family and everything for as long as I have, but I don't really speak. So, I know simply, I can count and I know names of animals and foods and things like this. Yeah, I definitely cannot speak. I studied other languages, in my younger days, including Russian, Japanese were my two main ones. And that was fine. And I could still, Russian and Japanese both have really difficult grammar, right? But pronunciation-wise, they're not so difficult, or at least as an English speaker, not so difficult. But with Chinese, I tried, even as far back as when I was 40, I studied a bit. The characters was okay because I already, from Japanese, knew some of the characters.
Yeah.
But the tones was really kind of a killer. Even for me, and Mandarin only has 4 tones, right? So compared to, I think Taiwanese has 9, and many of the other dialects have more. But the tones, especially after a certain age, it becomes really difficult to be able to do that. And if you don't manage tones correctly, you're going to likely make big gaffe when you speak to people. So I have not really been able to push my Chinese, unfortunately, beyond that. But that's why we push our children hard, so they won't be hampered by that. Starting from a age of 1 or 2, just in full immersion for them, and therefore they can speak like natives. They can read like natives. They can speak and do that for both English and for Chinese. That way, whatever happens in the future, they'll be covered, because you can be pretty sure those 2 languages are going to continue to dominate for her for probably many years. Yeah.
It's the same as my thoughts. Well, because my daughter, she is in bilingual Chinese-English program, and so she started to be in a preschool. She started preschool was like Chinese-English since 1.5-year-old.
Yeah.
So now she's kind of fluent, not native, but kind of fluent for her age. She's 7. And then, it's completely 2 different language families. So for her, it's 3. It's English, Russian, and Chinese. So super different. But then if she speaks 3 languages, it's there's so many opportunities here. So.
And I think, it opens opportunities from a career perspective, but also just from a social perspective. You can travel to so many places, and when you can interact with locals, they treat you through their language, they treat you very differently, obviously. And it just makes you more comfortable to explore. And it's that exploration process that introduces you to things you can't anticipate, right? The unknown unknowns. So the more languages you know, the better you are from that perspective. I think we knew that having your children start early, like you've done with your daughter, to start at a very young age, is key, because that can get you you have your best chance of not being stuck with a non-native accent. But we've also learned you really have to keep going with it, because we knew other, let's say, expats who their children were also in the same preschool and so nurse school and kindergarten program as our kids, and then move overseas, let's say to the UK or Australia or wherever, and if they don't keep it up, it's kind of shocking how fast they forget a lot of it. And although I think they're blessed that they could probably pick it up again, and if they studied, they could probably speak again maybe without an accent, so they probably retain some of that. But Chinese is the kind of language, especially if you want to read, where you have to use it every day. And I think, again, I'm blessed by having a wife that is a native speaker, and so she can do that with them every day, speak with them every day, and watch. They watch YouTube, they watch on TV, they do something, it'll be in Chinese.
Yeah. And
only sort of after dinner time, okay, now you can watch English. So they get the benefit of both worlds. I think for us the struggle has been more how do we manage our daughter, P5, she comes home from school and she's in Singlish mode. She comes home and she speaks like a native from a Singlish perspective, which is, I think, linguistically is fascinating. I think Singlish is fascinating, but it's not what you want your children. Your children need to be able to speak, whether it's British English or American English or whatnot, from a career and sort of a general competency perspective. You get much further by being able to speak sort of proper English or American English rather than say English. But picking up, Malay is, while not a language that would be widely useful in the Western world, in this part of the world is super useful as well. So for us, the next language we sort of want them to pick up more directly would be Malay and picking up on that too.
Yeah.
So again, the more you pick up, and if you diversify those language families early, the easier it is to pick them up later in life as well. Even if you may not be able to speak as a native, if you started at, 15, you'll be able to pick it up. My wife is an expert at picking up new languages readily. And I think part of that was because she grew up speaking 2 languages, or at least 2 languages. And so I want my children to be able to do that as well.
You are with one company for 25 years?
Yeah.
Yeah?
That's right.
How is it to be in the same company for like so many years?
It's a rarity these days. I realize there's still some.
It's like Japanese approach, actually.
in a way it is, isn't it? I think maybe I have a strong sort of loyalty streak. I think ingrained in me.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I stayed at Harvard for my PhD after undergraduate. I don't know. The company I work for, I really, right from the beginning, and through now what I do now, like I've always enjoyed the work that I do, both from a technical perspective, it tends to be really interesting, but also just from the impact that you're having on the company and for patients around the world, and then and also the people that I work with. I just hear all these horror stories of people in whether it's other industries or other companies where their boss isn't good, or their coworkers, they have issues with. And I just found, the people that I've worked with and the people that I've worked for and the people that have worked for me have just been, just the vast majority have just been really great individuals that I've learned a lot from and that I've enjoyed working with.
Hey guys, just a quick announcement. Don't skip. I'll be running a 3-day workshop called Fast Track to Views and Profits on YouTube. If you ever wanted to start your own channel, this is the best way to do it. You will learn how to choose the most profitable niche and how to beat the YouTube algorithm. You're gonna love it, I promise. Link in description, so sign up if it's for you. And now back to the video.
What would be like some important principle that you learned throughout this 25 years of your career in one company? Something really important that helped you to progress and get along well with people, with management, with your team?
You got to treat people with respect. I think treat people the way you would want to be treated yourself. I think people, whether they're your subordinates or your superiors, the same applies. Don't overpromise. I mean, you want to be ambitious but you need to be realistic, and you need to offer people your sound technical, for me in a technical field, your sound technical advice balanced by what you think is the right risks to take. So I think you can't be afraid to speak up. You can't be afraid to have those conversations with senior leaders to both make them aware of issues and situations, but also to let them know how you can support the organization's needs and what you can do to move things ahead in a fast and efficient manner. But I think the way you interact with people is the key. You got to be respectful. You have to foster that trust so that people can believe what you say and also know that they can trust what you can do for them and how you can support them as well. I think from a technical perspective, in a way, I've kind of learned like things that can go wrong, good chance that they will. You really have to be very, you have to look openly for where are the areas of biggest risk and what can you do to stave those off should those happen. And again, big multinational company like the one I work for is very good at trying to identify those and having sort of unified systems that people in different countries can use to work most effectively. But my experience here in Singapore has been very educational because part of what the Singapore government excels at in terms of planning and executing, you see that in local companies, in the companies based here as well, because all the citizens that grew up here have that talent as well, whether they're in the government or local. So I've just found way more than I saw like in my experience in the U.S. is that the ability of Singaporeans working for my company here in Singapore are top notch in terms of planning, identifying risks, and executing those to cost and executing those to the time schedules as best as anyone possibly could.
Yeah.
So I've gained a lot from that experience here for sure.
What's the meaning of life food?
I'm not a religious person, but I firmly believe in terms of sort of a moral and ethical code. And so, like I said, I think treating people with respect is a key thing. Treating people the way you would expect to be treated in return. But I also think, but not just other people, I think it's like living things in general. Like for me, how you treat wildlife is also important because I think this planet faces enough challenges as it is with things like global warming. And I think you need to respect, other living things on this planet and hopefully leave it in a better spot than it was when you entered the world, as difficult as that may be, but help and do that by supporting others. Teach others to spread that wealth, if you will. Share what you know with others and have them then take that even further than what you could do yourself. And empowering others is one of the best ways to accomplish something, because what you can do by yourself is always going to be more limited than what you can do as a group or as a team. So empowering people to be able to deliver more is to me one of the best ways to be efficient.
Are you genuinely optimistic about the world or pessimistic right now?
I'm middle ground. It's the last 8 years has been tough not to be pessimistic. Frankly, I have to admit, I've been pretty pessimistic about the U.S., especially as painful as it is. I've wanted to see it turn itself around from a political perspective, it's just so many issues, right? Everything from mental health and education system, violence and crime, and the how we treat the environment. Maybe this is why I'm not a politician. It's really hard to see how it gets through this current divide, and it's given a huge opportunity for other countries to step up and I think lead the way in that perspective. The U.S. is always going to be a key part of that, and I hope it can turn around to get back to where it was in terms of being seen as a trustworthy global leader. It doesn't need to lead by itself, as it did kind of seem to have done for so many years. But I think moving from what was a very well globally integrated society to one that's now increasingly segmented is a lose-lose for everybody. Nobody wins from that kind of increased nationalism, the increased siloing that we see of different countries. And I just think that's a real shame. And I think it's a shame at a time when the planet as a whole, from an environmental ecosystem perspective, kind of needs all the cohesive work it can do. So I'm hard not to be a bit pessimistic, just from an environmental perspective. But I try, we each just kind of need to do the part that we can, and teach our kids to do the part that they can on that as well, be a global citizen, but don't close off doors to other countries, other ethnicities, other races, because that's the only way, that integrated diversity is really what allows us as a human population to thrive. So I hope we get through this period of spreading ourselves apart, coming back together sooner than it looks at the moment.
Yeah, let's hope for it.